I just wanted to respond to a few things that were discussed from the other side of the House earlier. Just going back to something that Mr Borrows was saying, and a few of the other National MPs, saying that we don't basically have aspirations for people that are on benefits, that we don't care about them and the fact that and their progression in terms of them moving out from beyond being on a benefit. And Mr Chair, I just want to point out that is absolute rubbish. And one thing that we can see in terms of the contradiction between what that government says and then what they does is highlighted really clearly when we look back at the cutting of the training incentive allowance, Mr Chair. And I want to talk about that a little bit because it highlights the absolute lack of common sense that government has demonstrated in their cuts, in their reprioritising, if you want to call it that, of funding. And I want to discuss the success of that training incentive allowance and the fact that the government cut it, and then look at where we are now. So just over a year ago, we saw the national government move to make the heavy-handed cuts to the training incentive allowance. Now, a study of that particular scheme, Mr Chair, that was done between 1996 and 2001 found that for recipients of the domestic purposes benefit, the training incentive allowance was successful in helping beneficiaries to gain greater self-confidence, in removing financial barriers to education, and in reducing the amount of time spent by recipients on the benefit. On average, the amount of time spent on the benefit decreased and the amount of time spent in paid employment increased over time for recipients of the training incentive allowance, suggesting that the scheme was effective in increasing workforce participation. An average of 26 fewer weeks were spent on the benefit over the 6 years following the receipt of the training incentive allowance, compared to beneficiaries who did not receive the TIA. Now, Mr Chair, it makes no sense when you look at that evidence, when you look at that report, for that government to have cut that, particularly when they're talking about long-term welfare dependency and saying that their actions are because they wish to ensure that there aren't so many people that are dependent on welfare. Mr Chair, following that, when two women came out and spoke about the fact that the cuts were detrimental to them and their lives, the Minister of Social Development had no problem with dragging them through the mud, putting their details out there publicly, and basically just punishing them using that same kind of punitive approach towards them that she's doing right now with the welfare reforms, Mr Chair. And I think it's important to point out because it does highlight the lack of compassion that government has shown towards single mothers in particular, and also the fact that their moves have made no sense at all and actually have gone against the research with regards to things like the cuts to the training incentive allowance, despite the fact that we have reports that show that it was a successful initiative. Now, Mr Chair, we've heard from different single parents across the House tonight, and I think most of us that are logical and rational would agree that single parents do just want to get on with raising their kids. They don't enjoy being used as the government scapegoat to divert attention away from the fact that the government has done nothing to address unemployment and poverty in this country, and yet they find themselves in that situation, Mr Chair. Now, Mr Chair, in terms of this bill, there are some provisions of this bill that we do support, and we've discussed that. We support the increasing of benefit abatement income thresholds and the annual CPI adjustment of certain benefits. What we are fundamentally opposed to are the provisions on work testing and the discriminatory nature of the bill. Now, when you look at in terms of what it means in terms of discrimination, the woman who is on a widow's benefit, so someone whose partner has passed away, will not be work tested, but the person whose partner is still alive but no longer with them will be work tested. And I think it's fair to say, and we'd all agree on this side of the House at least, that it's an arbitrary separation and only serves to perpetuate the negative stigma of sole parenting. Now, also of concern is the Minister's inability to adequately define welfare dependency, and that came up during the Select Committee, or during the Social Services Select Committee, when we questioned the Minister of Social Development for a definition of welfare dependency, particularly long-term welfare dependency, to see whether it meant having been on a benefit for 5 years, or having been on a benefit for 7 years, or having been on, Mr Chair.